Welcome, where wars become stories. Lieutenant J. Waller of the 1st Battalion of Royal Marines remembered it clearly. He remembered how his men climbed up the dirt walls at Bunker Hill with their sharp blades attached to their guns, moving forward against the rebel fighters. The defenders shot their weapons until they ran out of gunpowder. And then came the attack. Sharp metal against bodies, guns used as clubs, smoke making it hard to breathe. Waller admitted that the terrible fighting was impossible to describe. It was, as he said, shocking, even for men who had seen war before. When the British red flag finally reached the top of the walls, victory seemed to be theirs. But the ground underneath was slippery with blood, and nearly half the British attackers had been killed or hurt in the charge. This was the strange truth about Bunker Hill: they claimed to win, but the cost was so high it felt like losing. British officers congratulated themselves for taking the position, but quietly admitted that one or two more victories like this would completely destroy the army. For the colonists, even though they had lost the hill, the battle proved something far more important. They had fought face to face with the strongest army in the world, and they had not been easily beaten. To understand the revolution that followed, one must begin here with the smoke rising over Charlestown, the cries of the wounded in the night, and the shocked realization on both sides. This would not be a quick or polite fight. It would be a brutal, grinding test of who could last longer. The American Revolution, we often imagine, was a war of clever surprise attacks in forests and patriots firing from behind trees. But at Bunker Hill, the truth was clear. The fight was as much about standing in lines with sharp blades as it was about being clever. The rebels fought in organized groups, resisting until supplies ran out. The British moved forward in the way they had been trained on European fields. Yet here in the colonies, those methods led to huge losses. The war that began with this fight would stretch for 8 long years, longer than anyone expected. It would drag on nearly as long as the American Civil War, the Mexican-American War, and the Spanish-American War combined. Few in London or Philadelphia could have imagined it would last this long. But the blood spilled on that hill showed what was coming. For the British, victory meant taking control. For the Americans, defeat still meant hope. And from that moment forward, each side began to understand the serious truth. Neither courage nor training alone would decide this struggle. Planning, supplies, help from other countries, and above all, lasting power would shape the future of a continent. The revolution had announced itself with fire and fury. Now the question remained: how could the greatest empire in the world lose to farmers and workers turned soldiers? Or perhaps, was there more to the American cause than we have been taught to believe? When the first shots rang out at Lexington and Concord in 1775, few on either side imagined the struggle would last nearly 10 years. Many in Britain expected a quick police action. A matter of a few military groups sent across the Atlantic to discipline rebellious colonists. In the taverns of New England, patriots boasted that one bold action might drive the redcoats back into the sea. Yet, like so many wars in history, the American Revolution stretched far beyond its opening promises, dragging on for 8 long, tiring years. To put this into perspective, 8 years was nearly the same length as 3 major wars combined: the American Civil War, the Mexican-American War, and the Spanish-American War. Those later wars burned hot and fierce, but they were brief by comparison. The Revolution, by contrast, was a war of slow wearing down, a contest not only of guns, but of lasting power, of which side could outlast the other. There is a temptation to imagine the war as a grand duel of styles, British soldiers standing stiff in bright red lines while Americans melted into the trees, shooting from cover like ghosts. The reality was far more complicated. Small fights and surprise attacks certainly happened, but they were not what won the war. The important battles, the ones that shifted momentum, were fought in regular formations in open fields with sharp blades and cannons roaring. At Trenton, Princeton, and Yorktown, the Americans won not through surprise tricks, but by adapting European-style fighting methods to American conditions. Washington's army marched, trained, and bled in the same way as the armies of Europe, only they did so with fewer supplies, less training, and far greater risks of falling apart. Surprise fighters, local militias, and expert shooters did their part, attacking supply lines and keeping British forces uneasy. But the heavy work of independence rested on the Continental Army, a force that had to learn painfully and slowly how to stand face to face with the most professional army on earth. And so the revolution must be understood for what it was, not a quick uprising, not a one-sided tale of scrappy underdogs, but a long war of exhaustion. The British bled resources across an ocean while the Americans bled men and spirit at home. What unfolded was a contest shaped as much by distance, politics, and supplies as by gunfire. Already by 1776, this truth was sinking in. For every British victory that painted the map red, there came the sobering realization that conquest did not equal control. For every American defeat, there lingered the whisper that they had survived one more day. And one more day meant hope. The revolution was becoming something larger than anyone had imagined, not just a colonial revolt, but a test of lasting power between empire and rebellion. The coming years would pit personalities, plans, and entire societies against each other, forcing both Britain and America to learn that wars are not always won by those who appear stronger at the start. The revolution was not only a clash of armies. It was a contest of leadership. At the heart of the patriot cause stood men whose names would be remembered, though not always in glory. Foremost was George Washington, appointed commander of the Continental Army in 1775. Tall, imposing, and quiet, Washington's very presence inspired a sense of steadiness among troops who often had little else to cling to. He was no perfect general. His defeat in New York was nearly disastrous, almost costing the cause in its first year. But his strength lay not in brilliant tactics but in toughness. He understood that survival was victory. At Boston, he forced the British to abandon the city. At Trenton and Princeton, he seized quick chances, striking with daring and precision in the dead of winter. In these moments, Washington revealed himself not as a Napoleon before his time, but as something perhaps rarer, a commander who knew when not to fight and when to risk everything. Then there was Horatio Gates, praised as the hero of Saratoga. It was under his leadership that the British surrendered one of their largest armies, a triumph that excited Europe and convinced France to openly join the war. Yet Gates's fame rose too fast. Drunk on his glory, he overestimated his own abilities, leading to the disaster at Camden, where his army collapsed against Cornwallis's blade charges. His fall was quick and embarrassing, a reminder that glory in war is fragile, and reputations can turn to dust in a single afternoon. Standing in Gates's shadow was a man whose name has become the same as betrayal, Benedict Arnold. Before his betrayal, however, Arnold was among the Revolution's most daring and effective commanders. He seized Fort Ticonderoga, giving the Americans important artillery. At Saratoga, though Gates claimed the praise, it was Arnold who led the fierce attacks that broke the British line. Fierce, reckless, and endlessly ambitious, Arnold seemed destined for greatness. But complaints, some real, some imagined, grew. Passed over for promotion, accused of dishonesty, and turned away from fellow officers. Arnold chose dishonor over loyalty. His switching sides to the British shocked the nation, a wound deeper than any battlefield loss. In Arnold's story, we see the revolution's darker truth: not every patriot remained loyal, and the line between honor and ambition could be dangerously thin. Finally, there was Nathanael Greene, Washington's most trusted helper. Calm where others were hasty, thoughtful where others were impulsive, Greene transformed the war in the South. After Gates's failure, Greene took command and used a plan of lasting power: small fights, retreating, stretching British supply lines to breaking. He rarely won battles outright, but he won the campaign, wearing down Cornwallis's army until it was forced to retreat. Washington once remarked that Greene was second only to him in importance to the American cause. If Washington was the revolution's steady heart, Greene was its thinking mind. These men, Washington the unbreakable, Gates the flawed, Arnold the traitor, Greene the planner, showed the contradictions of the revolution. They were not mythic heroes but human beings, ambitious, uncertain, sometimes brilliant, sometimes deeply flawed. Yet, it was through their choices and their failures that the revolution stumbled forward toward survival. The American command was a patchwork, often undermined by politics, personal rivalries, and lack of experience. But within that fragile structure lay the spark of something lasting, leaders who, despite their flaws, adapted to a war unlike any they had fought before. If the American generals were created by necessity, the British commanders arrived polished by years of formal service. They carried with them the weight of empire, the traditions of a professional officer group, and the expectation that this colonial revolt would be stopped with little difficulty. Yet, for all their experience, they found themselves tangled in a war that destroyed reputations and revealed the limits of imperial power. The first of these was General William Howe, who took over overall command after the bloody siege of Bunker Hill. Howe was no fool. He had served with honor in earlier wars and knew the craft of siege and movement. His capture of New York in 1776 nearly crushed the rebellion, forcing Washington's beaten army to retreat across New Jersey. Later, he took Philadelphia, the heart of the colonies. But Howe's caution, his preference for comfortable quarters and winter balls over relentless pursuit, proved costly. His decision to focus on Philadelphia left his colleague, General John Burgoyne, stranded in upstate New York. The result was disaster. Burgoyne's entire army was surrounded and forced to surrender at Saratoga. Howe's victories glittered on the map, but strategically they rang hollow. Burgoyne himself was the example of British overconfidence. Nicknamed Gentleman Johnny, he was charming and ambitious, yet terribly unprepared for the supply nightmare of campaigning through the dense forests of northern New York. His plan to cut off New England by marching down from Canada looked perfect on paper, but collapsed under the reality of wilderness roads, stretched supply lines, and an enemy that attacked him at every turn. His surrender in 1777 was not merely a military defeat. It was a turning point in world opinion, convincing France that the American cause was real. In the wake of these mistakes, Sir Henry Clinton took over command. Clinton was intelligent and aware of the challenges Britain faced, but he was also cautious to a fault. Operating across an ocean, dependent on unclear instructions from London, Clinton rarely risked big action. He strengthened British positions, but his inability or unwillingness to deliver a killing blow allowed the revolution to drag on. The most aggressive of Britain's generals was Charles Cornwallis. Ruthless and energetic, he carved his way through the South, winning battles in Georgia and the Carolinas. His victories spread alarm among patriots and seemed to restore British momentum. Yet, Cornwallis's boldness became his downfall. Chased and attacked by Nathanael Greene, he pushed too far, stretching his forces thin until he was driven into retreat. His final stand at Yorktown would end in embarrassment, surrendering not just his army, but Britain's hopes of crushing the rebellion. Taken together, the British High Command reveals a troubling picture: officers of great skill and background, but held back by poor coordination, broken planning, and the huge burden of distance. Orders from London could take months to arrive, by which time the realities on the ground had changed completely. What might have succeeded in the open fields of Europe failed in the vast untamed landscapes of North America. More than once, British generals underestimated the Americans, not their courage perhaps, but their lasting power. Howe, Burgoyne, Clinton, and Cornwallis each in his way contributed to Britain's misfortune. It was not foolishness alone that doomed them, but the slow, grinding realization that even the finest generals cannot overcome every obstacle when fighting 3,000 miles from home. On paper, the balance of experience tilted heavily toward Britain. Many of its generals had studied at military schools steeped in the teachings of European warfare, how to move lines of infantry, use artillery, and conduct sieges against protected towns. They had fought in the great conflicts of the 18th century, from the 7 Years' War to campaigns across Europe and India. By contrast, most American officers had little more than militia service to their names. Their understanding of warfare was pieced together from scattered fights along colonial frontiers. Yet the revolution did not unfold on the plains of Flanders or the fields of Saxony. It raged across dense forests, rocky hills, winding rivers, and vast stretches of untamed countryside. The very land worked to dull Britain's advantage. Roads were poor, bridges fragile, and maps unreliable. Where British officers tried to apply textbook movements, American commanders took advantage of their close knowledge of the land. They understood the rhythms of rivers, the cover of wooded ridges, the tight spots where a few men could delay an entire column. The 7 Years' War had been a harsh teacher for many Americans, Washington among them. Though his early service ended in mistakes, it taught him the unforgiving lessons of frontier warfare, supply lines that vanished in the wilderness, sudden attacks from unseen enemies, the impossibility of relying on European drill alone. Men like Washington and Greene carried these memories into the Revolution, shaping their understanding that survival mattered more than grand displays of battlefield brilliance. For the British, the land was more than an inconvenience. It was an enemy in its own right. Every mile marched inland pulled their troops farther from naval resupply. Wagons got stuck in muddy tracks, horses died from exhaustion, and supply trains stretched thin across hostile countryside. Local guides could mislead or abandon them. Scouts struggled to get through thickets where riflemen lurked. The vastness of America swallowed Britain's strength one step at a time. Even in moments of triumph, the land mocked their efforts. After seizing cities like New York or Philadelphia, the British found that control of city centers did not translate into control of the surrounding countryside. The rebels disappeared into forests, striking supply wagons, harassing stragglers, forcing the redcoats to march and march again with no end in sight. This contrast, formal experience versus lived familiarity, did not guarantee American victories, but it wore down Britain's ability to press its advantages. A European-trained officer could organize a perfect movement on the parade ground. Yet in the thickets of New Jersey or the swamps of the Carolinas, his soldiers found themselves confused, attacked, and exhausted. Meanwhile, American commanders, though less polished, gradually transformed hardship into opportunity. They learned to fight not just the enemy, but the land itself, turning hills, rivers, and woods into silent helpers. In this way, geography became one of the Revolution's most important weapons. Britain's experience was undeniable, but America's land and the men who understood it would prove just as powerful as any general on the field. If one watches popular documentaries or even listens to schoolhouse tales, the American Revolution is often painted as a struggle between two completely different ways of war. On one side, the British marching stiffly in bright red rows. On the other, clever Americans shooting from behind rocks and trees. It is a compelling story, but like many myths, it hides more than it reveals. The truth is that America did not win independence with militias hiding in the brush. Surprise tactics played a role, yes, attacking wagons, disrupting messengers, spreading unease. But important battles, the ones that broke armies and shifted momentum, were fought with trained groups standing in ordered lines. The Continental Army, not the part-time militia, bore the true weight of the revolution. The militia were unreliable helpers at best. They were often untrained, poorly equipped, and most importantly, not required to fight. A farmer might march to a battlefield in one campaign, then simply vanish the next week to tend his crops. Some refused to serve far from home. At moments of crisis, whole companies melted away overnight, leaving commanders scrambling to fill the gaps. Their guns varied in quality, their gunpowder was scarce, and their discipline frequently failed under the pressure of blade charges. Militia often broke and ran before contact was even made. Contrast this with the British Red Coat. He was trained to fire 3 shots a minute, his movements precise, his toughness hammered into him through relentless training. Most carried the blade, a weapon as much mental as practical. When the order came to charge, glittering steel thrust forward in a solid wall. Militia often broke and ran before contact was even made. To face such a charge required not just courage, but the kind of hardened discipline that only a standing army could maintain. American riflemen added some color to the battlefield. The famed sharpshooters wielding Kentucky long rifles, deadly accurate at greater range than the standard gun. They picked off officers and spread panic in enemy ranks. Yet their numbers were tiny, perhaps 3% of the Continental Army at best. Useful, yes. Decisive, no. The revolution could not rest on their shoulders. The Continental Army, ragged and underfed as it was, learned to fight in lines. Washington insisted on discipline even when his men lacked shoes. Baron von Steuben, a Prussian veteran, transformed raw recruits into soldiers capable of moving with precision, drilling them endlessly at Valley Forge. It was this transformation, the evolution from a collection of militias into a true army, that gave the revolution its backbone. Thus, the popular image of rebels in buckskins forever attacking from the woods misses the heart of the struggle. America did not defeat Britain by rejecting European warfare, but by mastering enough of it to survive. The militia harassed, the riflemen attacked. But the Continental Army, battered and stubborn, stood in the line of battle and proved that independence would not be won in small fights alone. To understand why the revolution lasted so long, one must first grasp what it meant to face a British redcoat. These were not raw recruits, but professional soldiers trained in the art of war from dawn to dusk. Their uniforms of scarlet wool may seem flashy to modern eyes, but to people of that time, the red coat was a symbol of authority, discipline, and fear. The British Army of the 18th century was among the most disciplined in the world. A red coat could fire and reload his gun in 15 to 20 seconds, faster than most continental soldiers could hope to manage. Hours of drill turned firing lines into machines of destruction. Each blast slamming out like clockwork. Officers demanded perfection, guns raised as one, fire rippling down the line, blades leveled in perfect unity. And then there was the charge. If blasts failed to break an enemy, the order came, fix blades. To militia or half-trained recruits, the sight of hundreds of gleaming blades moving forward in silence was often too much to bear. Entire companies dissolved before the red coats even reached them. At Camden, when British grenadiers advanced with blades drawn, the American line broke and fled in minutes. It was not courage alone that held an army together under such pressure. It was discipline, and that was Britain's greatest weapon. Elite units increased this power. Grenadiers, tall and imposing, were often positioned on the right side, where their sheer presence could shatter spirit. Light infantry companies, trained to move quickly and adapt to uneven ground, gave the British flexibility in pursuit and small fights. These formations represented the cutting edge of European warfare, and they were sharpened through decades of campaigning across the globe. To colonial farmers, hastily turned soldiers, such opponents seemed unstoppable. Many wrote in their diaries of the awe and dread they felt when facing the steady ranks of British regulars. Even experienced Continental officers admitted that to stand against a blade charge required nerves of iron. And yet, the very professionalism of the red coat could be a double-edged sword. The stiffness of their drill, designed for European battlefields, sometimes struggled in America's wilderness. Blast fire that worked perfectly on flat fields became less effective when trees and hills broke the lines. Blade charges could terrify militia, but were less decisive against seasoned Continentals who learned to hold firm. Still, the reputation of the red coat lasted. He was not unbeatable, but he was powerful. For much of the war, the British soldier remained the most feared element on the battlefield. If the Americans were to triumph, they would have to prove that courage, adaptation, and toughness could withstand the might of one of history's most professional armies. No army can march without weapons, and in the American Revolution, what soldiers carried in their hands often shaped the course of the fighting. Both the British and the Americans used guns as their primary tool of war. But behind those weapons lay very different systems of supply and very different struggles to keep men armed. The British carried the Brown Bess, a .75 caliber flintlock gun that had been the backbone of the Empire's armies for nearly a century. It was sturdy, reliable, and designed for the rhythm of blast fire, line upon line of soldiers unleashing smoke and shot in unison. Each gun was fitted for a blade, making it as much a thrusting weapon as a firearm. The Brown Bess was more than a gun. It was a symbol of imperial power, standardized and mass-produced, the mark of a professional army. Across the lines, the Americans carried a patchwork of arms. At first, some had their own hunting pieces, others seized captured brown besses. But gradually, thanks to French support, the Charleville gun became their standard. Slightly smaller in caliber at .69, it was lighter, easier to handle, and well suited for the kind of quick blasts and blade charges that Washington's men were learning to execute. French shipments of these guns, and the gunpowder to fire them, were lifelines without which the Continental Army could scarcely have continued. Then there were the rifles. Romanticized in legend, but often misunderstood, the Kentucky long rifle with its grooved barrel could hit a target at distances a gun could not dream of. American riflemen gained fame for picking off officers from afar, striking terror into British ranks and used to such marksmanship. Yet rifles were slow to load, lacked blades, and were far too few to change the outcome of great battles. They were a precise tool where the war required hammers. Beyond the weapons themselves lay the grimmer story of supplies. For the British, guns and gunpowder were plentiful, but every round, every cartridge had to be shipped across an ocean. A single storm could delay supplies for weeks, even months. Reinforcements often arrived too late, their effectiveness swallowed by the sheer distances involved. The redcoats, for all their power, were chained to the ports, unable to march too far inland without risking starvation or rebellion. For the Americans, the challenge was even starker. Early in the war, gunpowder was so scarce that soldiers sometimes went into battle with only a few rounds apiece. Guns broke. Blades were in short supply. Uniforms and shoes wore out with no replacements in sight. Washington begged constantly with Congress for supplies, but the new government lacked both funds and organization. At Valley Forge, soldiers trained barefoot in the snow, guns held together with twine, their spirits sustained less by equipment than by sheer determination. It was foreign aid that tipped the scales. French guns, Spanish silver, Dutch loans all flowed into the rebellion, slowly transforming ragged volunteers into a true army. Every Charleville gun delivered was a step toward survival. Every crate of gunpowder smuggled past British blockades was a spark of hope. Thus, the arming of the armies was more than a matter of steel and wood. It was a mirror of the war itself. Britain's power was vast but stretched thin. America's weakness was crippling yet slowly compensated by helpers abroad. In every gun fired, in every blade charge, one can hear not only the clash of armies, but the echo of supply ships creaking across the Atlantic, carrying the tools of both conquest and independence. If guns and gunpowder told one side of the revolution, hunger and frost told the other. Nowhere is this truth more stark than at Valley Forge, the winter camp of 1777 to 1778. Here in the frozen hills of Pennsylvania, the revolution nearly withered before it had the chance to bloom. The numbers are haunting. Of the 12,000 men who marched into the camp, nearly 2,000 would not march out. They died not by British bullets, but by starvation, disease, and exposure. Frost-bitten feet blackened and rotted. Soldiers huddled in crude huts that barely kept out the wind. Many lacked coats, blankets, even shoes. Washington's men left bloody footprints in the snow as they trained, their feet worn away to nothing. Diaries and letters speak with a quiet despair. One soldier described chewing on boiled leather for lack of food. Another wrote that he had not seen bread for weeks. The threat of desertion loomed large. Many wondered if the cause was doomed, if it was worth dying by inches in the bitter cold. Washington himself, walking among his men, admitted in private letters that the army teetered on the edge of falling apart. And yet, Valley Forge was not merely a scene of suffering. It was a place of change. Amid the smoke of small fires came the arrival of Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, a Prussian officer who spoke little English, but carried with him the art of professional drill. Day after day, he trained ragged soldiers into disciplined ranks. He taught them to reload faster, to move with precision, to hold firm against the dreaded blade charges. His methods were harsh, but his humor and dedication won him the respect of the men. By spring, the army that staggered out of Valley Forge was not the same as the one that had entered. This transformation was as important as any battlefield victory. Valley Forge became the symbol of the revolution's lasting power, the idea that survival itself was triumph. The men had faced not just the enemy, but hunger, frost, and despair. And they had survived. Out of the misery of winter emerged an army forged in hardship, no longer a collection of militias, but a true continental force. The memory of Valley Forge lingered long after the war. To patriots, it was proof that independence had been earned in blood and sacrifice, not only on the battlefield, but in the long months of waiting, suffering, and refusing to break. To the soldiers who survived, it was a scar they carried for life, a reminder that liberty was not born in glory, but in lasting power. Thus, when we speak of the revolution, we must remember Valley Forge not as a battle, but as a test of will. It was here in hunger and death that America's army learned the strength to fight on. The revolution is often remembered as a united struggle of colonists against the British Crown. But the truth was far more complicated. The war did not merely pit Americans against redcoats. It set neighbor against neighbor, father against son, community against community. It was as much a civil war as it was a war for independence. Support for the Patriot cause varied greatly by region. In New England and much of the North, anger against British trade restrictions and taxes ran deep. Merchants complained under London's rules. Farmers resented troops staying in their towns. Here, independence carried an undeniable appeal. Yet in other places, particularly in the South, loyalty to Britain remained strong. Wealthy planters often feared that a revolution could unravel the social order, start slave uprisings, or undermine their economic ties to Britain. The Loyalists, Americans who sided with the Crown, were not a small minority. By some guesses, they made up a fifth of the colonial population, perhaps more. They included royal officials, Anglican clergy, merchants tied to British trade, and even ordinary farmers who simply feared the chaos of rebellion. For them, the Crown represented stability, while the Patriot cause seemed reckless and dangerous. The division could turn violent. Families split apart when sons chose different sides. Entire towns were torn by revenge attacks. Loyalist homes were burned, their property seized, their families driven into exile. Patriots, in turn, suffered raids and killings carried out by Loyalist militias and their native helpers. In the Carolinas, the fighting often turned into brutal local feuds with neighbors settling old grudges under the banner of politics. Religion, too, played a role. Congregationalists and Presbyterians leaned heavily toward independence, while many Anglicans held to loyalty. Sermons thundered from churches, some declaring the rebellion as a sacred struggle for liberty, others condemning it as sinful rebellion against God's chosen authority. The revolution seeped into every part of life, shaping not just politics, but the deepest moral and spiritual beliefs of the people. Even within the Patriot movement, unity was hard to find. Congress quarreled endlessly. State governments resisted central authority, and commanders in the field sometimes pursued personal glory at the expense of cooperation. Yet, despite these divisions, the idea of independence spread, binding enough people together to sustain the cause. This broken support is vital to understanding the revolution. It was not a unanimous uprising of 13 colonies, but a messy, contested, often violent struggle that turned communities into battlegrounds. The revolution was both a war of liberation and a war of identity, forcing Americans to decide not just whether to break from Britain, but who they truly were. In the end, the Patriots won not because they commanded unanimous loyalty, but because they built a cause compelling enough to hold together long enough. Their opponents were never few, but they were scattered, disorganized, and reliant on British strength that stretched thin across the ocean. The revolution's greatest danger was always internal. And yet, despite the breaks, the vision of independence lasted. For the first 2 years of the revolution, America stood largely alone. Ragged militias and the new Continental Army faced the greatest empire in the world with little more than borrowed gunpowder and desperate determination. But the war's fate would not be decided only in Boston or Philadelphia. It would be shaped in Paris, Madrid, and Amsterdam, in the palaces of kings, in the halls of finance. The revolution became a global struggle, not because America was strong, but because Britain had enemies everywhere. France was the first and most important helper. Still hurting from its defeat in the 7 Years' War, humiliated by the loss of Canada and India, France saw in the American rebellion a chance for revenge. At first, French support came quietly, shipments of guns, gunpowder, and uniforms smuggled through the Caribbean. French officers volunteered their swords. Among them, a young idealistic aristocrat, the Marquis de Lafayette. Barely 19, Lafayette crossed the ocean to fight for liberty in a land he had never seen, tying his fate to Washington's army. His enthusiasm inspired the Americans and gave their cause respect abroad. After Saratoga, France made its move openly. In 1778, it signed a treaty of alliance, recognizing American independence and promising ships, soldiers, and treasure to the fight. The balance of power shifted overnight. No longer was Britain battling rebellious colonies. It was facing a coalition war. Spain soon followed, though more careful. Its interest was less in liberty than in reclaiming lost territories and weakening Britain's hold over the seas. Spanish forces attacked British positions along the Gulf Coast and the Mississippi, while fleets joined the French in challenging British power in the Atlantic. Meanwhile, the Dutch provided vital loans, sending money that kept the struggling Continental Congress afloat. Britain suddenly found itself surrounded. What began as a colonial rebellion now threatened to become a global conflict stretching from the Caribbean to Gibraltar, from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. The Royal Navy, once supreme, strained to protect trade routes and distant possessions. The Siege of Gibraltar in 1779, the largest battle of the entire Revolution in terms of manpower, drew tens of thousands of troops into a contest far from American shores. Though Britain held Gibraltar, the cost in resources was huge. International aid did more than supply guns and ships. It gave the American cause respect. Patriots who once feared they might be crushed now saw European powers aligning with them. The war for independence became a war of empires, and America, fragile though it was, stood at the center of it. Yet this aid came with irony. France and Spain did not support Republican ideals. They supported their own royal ambitions. America's liberty was to them a weapon to weaken Britain. Still, whatever the motives, the effect was undeniable. Without French ships, Yorktown would never have been possible. Without Spanish pressure, Britain might have moved more forces to the colonies. Without Dutch money, the Continental Army might have simply dissolved. The revolution was no longer an isolated struggle. It had become a world war, and Britain's might, spread thin across oceans and continents, was beginning to fray. From the beginning, Britain's commanders believed the key to victory lay in cities. They were the centers of commerce, government, and communication. Capture Boston. Capture New York. Capture Philadelphia. Surely the rebellion would collapse once its centers of resistance were cut away. It was a plan that reflected European thinking. Wars were won by holding capitals and fortresses, by seizing the lifelines of trade and authority. And at first, the logic seemed sound. In 1776, General William Howe captured New York, forcing Washington's beaten army into retreat. The city, the largest in the colonies, became the crown jewel of British control. A year later, Philadelphia, the heart of colonial politics, fell into British hands. Redcoats paraded through its streets while Congress fled into the countryside. London rejoiced, imagining the rebellion on the brink of collapse. But in America, cities were not the war. They were trophies, yes, but they were islands in a vast sea of resistance. Taking New York or Philadelphia did not mean controlling the farms, the villages, or the countryside where the revolution drew its strength. As soon as British troops moved outward, supply lines stretched thin, vulnerable to attacks and raids. They could win a city, but holding the land beyond it proved frustratingly difficult. The flaw in the plan became clear at Saratoga. General John Burgoyne marched down from Canada in 1777, intending to slice New England off from the other colonies. His army was meant to meet Howe's in a great joining. But Howe had chosen to seize Philadelphia instead, leaving Burgoyne isolated in the forests of upstate New York. Starved of supplies, harassed on every side, his army collapsed into surrender. What was meant to be a master stroke became a disaster of historic proportions. Britain's focus on cities created further problems. Garrisons ate up manpower that could not be spared elsewhere. Communication across the Atlantic added another layer of confusion. Orders from London arrived months late, often contradicting the realities on the ground. Generals argued, plans failed, and coordination broke down. By clinging to the old European model of conquest, Britain found itself bleeding resources without ever delivering a decisive blow. The American countryside remained stubbornly defiant. Farmers supplied rebel forces. Militias gathered and scattered at will. And Washington's army, though beaten repeatedly, never vanished. The fall of a city might have crippled a European kingdom. In America, it was a wound, but not a fatal one. This was the great miscalculation of British planning. They fought to seize points on a map while the Revolution fought for time and survival. And as the years wore on, the weight of distance, poor communication, and the sheer size of the continent turned those captured cities into gilded cages, symbols of power that masked the reality of Britain's failing grip. In the earliest days of the Revolution, the Americans often tried to fight as Europeans did, big battles, grand attacks, bold gambles. And almost without fail, those gambles ended in disaster. The invasion of Canada in 1775, meant to rally French Canadians to the cause, collapsed in hunger and frost. Washington's defense of New York turned into a rout, his army nearly surrounded and destroyed. Even when the rebels fought bravely, as at Bunker Hill, they paid dearly in casualties and gained little. These failures forced a hard lesson upon the Continental Army. Glory was not the path to victory. Survival was. Washington, unlike Horatio Gates or Benedict Arnold, grasped this truth with grim clarity. He did not need to win great battles. He needed only to keep his army alive. So long as the Continental Army existed, the Revolution lived. That meant retreating when necessary, refusing battle on unfavorable terms, and striking only when the odds tipped sharply in his favor. At Trenton, in the dead of winter, Washington gambled just enough, crossing the icy Delaware to surprise a Hessian camp. It was a small victory, but it energized a nation weary of defeat. At Princeton, he struck again, slipping away from superior forces to attack an isolated British group. These triumphs were not decisive in military terms, but in mental ones. They reminded Americans that their cause was not hopeless. This way of thinking about war matured over time. By the later years, American commanders like Nathanael Greene perfected the art of wearing down. Greene rarely sought direct fight. Instead, he stretched Cornwallis thin across the Carolinas, fighting small battles, harassing supply lines, retreating before overwhelming strength. Every fight weakened the British, not by breaking them in a single clash, but by bleeding them slowly, relentlessly. It was a plan born not of theory, but of necessity. The Americans could not afford to lose men recklessly. Nor could they replace losses as Britain could. Their army was fragile, always on the brink of collapse, plagued by desertion and supply shortages. Yet by fighting selectively, by forcing the British to chase shadows, the Americans turned weakness into strength. In many ways, this adaptation echoed the landscape itself. America was vast, untamed, and resistant to control. Just as the forests and rivers consumed British campaigns, so too did the Americans adopt a plan of lasting power, absorbing blows and retreating, only to re-emerge when least expected. Failure then was not the end. It was the teacher. The Americans learned through bitter defeats what kind of war they could and could not fight. They could not match Britain gun for gun in open fields, but they could refuse destruction, deny Britain easy victories, and wait for the Empire's will to break. By the time the French fleet entered the war, the Americans had already reshaped their approach into something uniquely suited to their struggle. Washington's refusal to gamble the revolution on one desperate showdown ensured that when the important moment did arrive, at Saratoga, at Yorktown, the American army was still there to seize it. The revolution was in the end a study in adaptation. From the ashes of failure, the Americans learned the discipline of patience. From defeat, they created the wisdom to last. In the summer of 1777, Britain gambled on a bold plan. General John Burgoyne, Gentleman Johnny, would march south from Canada with a large army, cutting through the wilderness of upstate New York. His goal was to seize control of the Hudson River, splitting rebellious New England off from the rest of the colonies. In theory, another British force under General Howe would march north from New York City to meet him, tightening a grip around the heart of the rebellion. On paper, it was perfect. In reality, it was a disaster waiting to unfold. The American wilderness swallowed Burgoyne's progress. Dense forests, muddy roads, and long supply lines slowed his army to a crawl. Every wagon, every cannon had to be dragged through land that swallowed horses and exhausted men. Local militias harassed his columns, cutting down trees across roads, picking off stragglers, and denying him food. Meanwhile, Howe had chosen to march on Philadelphia instead, leaving Burgoyne to his fate. By September, Burgoyne's army, tired and poorly supplied, faced a growing American force near Saratoga. Under General Horatio Gates, though much of the real credit belonged to Benedict Arnold, the Americans stood their ground. At Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights, Arnold led fierce counterattacks, rallying his men and hurling them against British lines until Burgoyne's troops broke. Surrounded, starved, and with no hope of relief, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army of nearly 6,000 men. The surrender at Saratoga was more than a military victory. It was a political earthquake. For the first time, a major British force had been decisively defeated and captured. The myth of British unbeatable power cracked. In Europe, diplomats took note. France, long watching from the sidelines, now saw proof that the American cause was not a doomed rebellion, but a real war for independence. In 1778, France entered the conflict openly, bringing with it fleets, money, and soldiers. Spain and the Netherlands would soon follow, drawn less by love of liberty than by the chance to weaken Britain. For the Americans, Saratoga was a surge of hope. Soldiers and civilians alike celebrated, believing the tide had finally turned. But the victory also revealed the fragile nature of American command. Gates basked in the glory, claiming the praise, while Arnold, whose leadership had been decisive, was angry at the slight. Wounded in battle, bitter, and feeling unrecognized, Arnold's resentment would grow, eventually pushing him down the path of betrayal. Thus, Saratoga, the Revolution's greatest triumph, also planted the seeds of its most infamous betrayal. Still, in the broader arc of the war, Saratoga was the hinge upon which everything turned. Without it, France might never have risked open war with Britain. Without French ships, Yorktown would have been impossible. Without European support, the revolution might have withered in exhaustion. Saratoga proved that the Americans could not only survive, but win. And that realization changed the world. After Saratoga and France's entry into the war, Britain found itself on the defensive in the north. New England was too fiercely rebellious and the middle colonies too unstable to secure. So London shifted its gaze to the south. The plan was simple: take advantage of loyalist feeling in the Carolinas and Georgia, rally those loyal to the crown, and roll northward, strangling the rebellion from its softer underbelly. At first, the plan seemed to work. British forces swept into Georgia in 1778, capturing Savannah. The following year, Charleston, one of the South's most important ports, fell after a brutal siege. Thousands of American soldiers were taken prisoner, the largest surrender of Patriot forces in the entire war. The British command, encouraged, believed the South could be pacified with a mixture of military might and loyalist support. Into this theater stepped Charles Cornwallis, bold, aggressive, and convinced of his mission. Cornwallis carved a path of victories through the Carolinas. At Camden in 1780, Horatio Gates, who had been praised as the hero of Saratoga, led a poorly prepared American army into battle. When British regulars advanced with blades, the militia on Gates's sides broke and fled almost instantly. The defeat was total, and Gates himself fled nearly 200 miles in retreat. It was one of the darkest moments of the Revolution, and spirit in the South fell. But where Gates failed, Nathanael Greene emerged. Washington trusted him with the shattered remains of the Southern Army, and Greene adopted a plan of patience. He knew he could not match Cornwallis man for man. Instead, he embraced a war of lasting power. Greene wrote, "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again." His goal was not to win big battles, but to bleed Cornwallis, to stretch his supply lines, to wear down his strength by degrees. Greene divided his forces, forcing Cornwallis to chase him across vast areas of the Carolinas. At Cowpens, Daniel Morgan, serving under Greene, executed a brilliant double trap, luring the British into a trap and crushing one of their best units. At Guilford Courthouse, Greene's men fought hard before retreating, leaving Cornwallis technically victorious, but at a cost so severe it hollowed out his army. Meanwhile, the countryside burned with irregular warfare. Patriot fighters like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, harassed British groups, attacked wagons, and melted into the wilderness. Loyalist and Patriot militias clashed in brutal civil war, neighbors turning on one another with ferocity that shocked even seasoned officers. The South became not just a battlefield, but a patchwork of revenge and payback. By the summer of 1781, Cornwallis had chased Greene deep into North Carolina, but found himself dangerously overextended. His supply lines stretched thin, his men exhausted, his victories increasingly hollow. Greene, though often retreating, had achieved his aim. Cornwallis's advance had cost him more than it had gained. The British general, seeking refuge and reinforcements, turned northward toward Virginia and ultimately toward Yorktown. The Southern gamble had begun with confidence, but it ended by luring Britain into a trap of its own making. Cornwallis's victories filled reports with glory. Yet each step forward only carried him closer to disaster. By 1781, Cornwallis's march through the South had drained his strength. He had won battles but lost the war of wearing down, bleeding men and supplies he could not replace. Now seeking a secure base with access to the Royal Navy, Cornwallis moved his army north into Virginia and fortified a small coastal town, Yorktown. It seemed a safe position, hemmed in by rivers and with the sea at his back. In reality, it was a cage waiting to be shut. For George Washington, the opportunity was irresistible. Long frustrated by years of stalemate around New York, he seized upon intelligence that the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse would sail north from the Caribbean. If Washington could coordinate his army with the French Navy, the war might finally reach its decisive moment. The plan was bold and secrecy was vital. Washington marched his armies south, leaving New York under British eyes while French forces under the Comte de Rochambeau joined him. The two armies moved swiftly, covering hundreds of miles in weeks. By autumn, they converged on Virginia with one purpose, to trap Cornwallis. At sea, the French struck the crucial blow. In September 1781, off the Chesapeake, de Grasse's fleet clashed with the Royal Navy in the Battle of the Capes. The British, long masters of the ocean, were pushed back. With the Chesapeake sealed, Cornwallis's lifeline was cut. No reinforcements, no evacuation. His army was alone. On land, the noose tightened. Washington, Rochambeau, Lafayette, and their combined American-French forces surrounded Yorktown. Siege lines crept forward day by day, cannons roaring, trenches inching closer. Cornwallis's men, once confident, now found themselves battered by relentless bombardment. Entire defensive positions were shattered, their defenses collapsing under storm after storm of artillery fire. Then came the attacks. American and French troops stormed British positions in coordinated night attacks, seizing key fortifications with blades and sheer determination. Among the Americans was Alexander Hamilton, who led his men in a fierce charge to capture Redoubt 10, cementing his name in the Revolution story. With each position lost, Cornwallis's defenses crumbled. Inside Yorktown, the situation became desperate. Ammunition dwindled, food ran short, and disease spread among the trapped soldiers. Cornwallis attempted a breakout across the York River, but storms scattered his boats, dashing his last hope of escape. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis accepted the inevitable. He surrendered more than 7,000 men, his once proud army marching out with drums muffled, guns stacked, and flags furled. The surrender at Yorktown was not the final battle of the Revolution, but it was its breaking point. In London, news of the defeat struck like a thunderbolt. Parliament, weary of the cost, divided in will, and burdened by global war, began to lose its appetite for continuing. For America, Yorktown was not just a victory. It was proof. After years of retreat, hunger, and despair, the cause of independence had triumphed in the most dramatic way possible. The trap had sprung. An empire had been humbled. A new nation had been born. It is tempting to believe the revolution was decided at Yorktown, that Cornwallis's surrender ended the war in a single stroke. But history rarely fits so neatly into dramatic moments. Britain still had soldiers, ships, and resources. In theory, another army could have been sent, another campaign launched. The true question was not whether Britain could fight on, but whether it had the will. By 1781, the empire was stretched to its limits. Britain was no longer merely stopping a colonial rebellion. It was fighting a world war. French fleets threatened the Atlantic. Spain pressed along the Gulf Coast and besieged Gibraltar with tens of thousands of troops. Dutch financiers backed America's cause. British merchants watched nervously as their trade routes strained under blockade and privateers. What began as a punishment expedition in the colonies had become a struggle for imperial survival. At home, Parliament broke apart. Voices in London argued bitterly over planning. Some urged continued war, insisting America must not be abandoned. Others, weary of the mounting debt and rising taxes, pressed for peace. Every month the war dragged on, its costs multiplied. British taxpayers shouldered the burden of supplying troops across an ocean while their own livelihoods withered under the strain. Public opinion, once fiery with patriotic determination, turned sour. Meanwhile, the Americans held the one advantage Britain could not match, lasting power. Washington's army, though often defeated, had never been destroyed. The revolution survived setbacks because its very nature demanded only survival, not conquest. For Britain, holding the colonies meant endless occupation, endless expense, and endless resistance. For the Americans, simply refusing to break was enough. The vastness of the land also played its part. No matter how many cities Britain captured, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, the countryside slipped from its grasp as soon as the troops marched away. Victory on the battlefield rarely translated into control of the population. The Patriots, though divided and often disorganized, sustained a cause that seemed to grow stronger the longer it lasted. International support sealed Britain's fate. French guns, French silver, French fleets, these gave the Americans the ability not only to fight but to win. Without the French at Yorktown, Cornwallis would not have been trapped. Without Dutch loans, Congress could not have paid its soldiers. Without Spain, Britain would not have been forced to defend itself on so many fronts. The revolution was never truly America alone against Britain. It was Britain against a group of rivals eager to see its power lessened. In the end, Britain did not lose because it lacked soldiers or commanders, nor because its army was inferior. It lost because the war demanded more than it could give. Distance, politics, money, and the sheer stubbornness of its enemies combined to drain its will. By 1782, when talks began in Paris, the truth was undeniable. The empire could not sustain the fight. Thus, the revolution was not won by a single battle, but by a slow buildup of pressures. The Americans lasted. The French, Spanish, and Dutch stepped in. The British exhausted themselves. And together, these forces worked to make independence unavoidable. When the guns finally fell silent, and the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, the world had changed forever. A collection of colonies, once dismissed as unruly dependents of the crown, had forced the most powerful empire on earth to yield. The American Revolution had begun as a protest over taxes and representation. It ended as the birth of a new nation. But its legacy was more complicated than the triumphant myths that would later take root. For patriots, the revolution was proof that lasting power, sacrifice, and determination could overcome impossible odds. For loyalists, it was a bitter exile. Their homes burned, their lands taken, their loyalty branded as betrayal. Tens of thousands fled north to Canada or across the sea, their lives upended by a war they had never chosen. For enslaved Africans and Native Americans, the revolution's promise of liberty was often hollow. Many fought on both sides in the hope of freedom or survival, only to find their futures unchanged or even worsened by independence. The revolution also revealed the paradox of American identity. It was a war of liberation but also a civil war. It drew strength from ideals of liberty and self-rule, yet depended heavily on foreign monarchies to succeed. Its leaders were flawed men, sometimes brilliant, sometimes selfish, sometimes treacherous. Yet out of their contradictions, a republic was born. Internationally, the revolution shook the foundations of empire. Kings across Europe watched nervously, aware that if a colonial rebellion could succeed in America, the spark might spread. Indeed, within a decade, revolution would erupt in France, toppling a king and rewriting the political order of Europe. Across Latin America, independence movements drew inspiration from the American struggle. The revolution did not end with America. It ignited a century of upheaval across the world. And yet, memory has often softened its edges. We imagine heroic Minutemen and steadfast leaders, but forget the hunger at Valley Forge, the divisions in the countryside, the uncertainty that plagued every step. We tell of triumph at Yorktown, but less often of the weary years of retreat and defeat that came before it. The revolution was not inevitable, nor was it clean. It was messy, brutal, and deeply human. Still, from those hardships came something lasting, the belief that a people could shape their own fate. The United States would wrestle for generations with the meaning of its revolution, striving and often failing to live up to the ideals it proclaimed. But in the autumn of 1781, when Cornwallis's men stacked their guns at Yorktown, and in 1783, when Britain finally recognized independence, a door opened that could not be closed again. The legacy of the revolution is not just in battles won or treaties signed. It is in the questions it left behind, the questions of liberty, identity, and lasting power that still echo across history. The revolution was at once a war of guns and blades, of hunger and frost, of diplomacy and lasting power. It was America's first great test, and it was survived. Out of that survival, a nation was born.